The radio crackled at 03:14. A company commander in a concrete observation post wedged between two slag heaps southwest of Avdiivka picked up the handset, listened for 4 seconds, and said 2 words. "They're moving." 12 minutes later, the first Russian armored column of that particular morning would enter a stretch of frozen ground that the 110th Separate Mechanized Brigade had spent 4 months preparing to destroy. The column would not reach its objective. Only 3 vehicles would reverse back out of the kill zone. The rest would be left as burning landmarks on a battlefield that Ukrainian drone operators had memorized down to individual shell craters. What you're about to see, reconstructed from geolocated combat footage, satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and unit-level reporting, is how one brigade turned a coal processing plant and its surrounding slag heaps into the most expensive piece of real estate in the Russian military's 2023 campaign. How layered trenches, pre-registered artillery coordinates, and a doctrine built on patience-absorbed wave after wave of mechanized assault. And why the Russian command, despite pouring resources into this sector for months, could never break through. The story of the 110th at Avdiivka is not a story about heroism in the abstract. It is a story about engineering, discipline, and a particular kind of institutional knowledge. The knowledge of how to make an attacker pay maximum cost for minimum gain. By the end of this breakdown, you will understand exactly why that Western approach to the coke plant became a graveyard for Russian armored vehicles, and what it cost both sides to stand in those trenches through an entire Ukrainian winter. Avdiivka sits in the Donetsk Oblast like a knot in a rope. The city itself is modest, a mid-sized industrial settlement built around the Avdiivka Coke and Chemical Plant, one of the largest coking facilities in Europe, an angular sprawl of towers, conveyors, slag heaps, and processing infrastructure covering several square kilometers on the city's western edge. Before the full-scale invasion, the plant employed thousands. By 2023, it was a fortified ghost facility, its industrial skeleton serving an entirely different purpose. The strategic logic of Avdiivka is straightforward. It sits on elevated terrain relative to the surrounding steppe. It commands sightlines north toward Donetsk city, and it anchors a section of the line that had been contested in one form or another since 2014. Ukrainian forces had been improving their defensive positions in and around the city for years before February 2022. When the full-scale invasion came, those years of preparation became immediately, visibly relevant. The 110th Separate Mechanized Brigade was not a unit improvised for the emergency. It was an established formation with institutional memory of this specific ground. By mid-2022, the brigade had primary responsibility for the western approaches to Avdiivka, including the ground directly adjacent to the coke plant's industrial footprint. The mission was defensive. Hold the line, deny Russian forces the high ground and the road network converging on the city from the west and southwest, and make every Russian attempt to advance prohibitively costly. Russia's objective was the inverse. From positions in and around the settlement of Opitin to the southwest, and from the north along the industrial zone's outer perimeter, Russian units, a rotating cast that included elements of the 1st Donetsk People's Republic Army Corps alongside regular Russian ground forces, pushed repeatedly toward the plant and the urban approaches behind it. Capturing Avdiivka would give Russia a significant propaganda victory, eliminate a long-standing Ukrainian salient, and free up forces for pressure elsewhere along the Donetsk front. The prize was real. The approach was the problem. Here is the first thing you need to understand about this sector. The terrain around the coke plant is not open steppe. It is a layered industrial landscape where decades of coking operations have deposited slag, the waste material from coal processing, into enormous artificial mounds rising 10, 15, 20 meters above the surrounding ground. These heaps are not evenly distributed. They create a broken, irregular topography that channels movement into specific corridors, limits the usefulness of vehicle-mounted optics, and provides natural elevation to defenders positioned on or behind the heaps. A defender who has mapped this terrain, who knows which ridgeline of compressed slag covers which approach, who has pre-registered artillery coordinates on the 3 viable vehicle lanes through the industrial fringe, that defender holds an enormous advantage over an attacker moving through the same ground for the first time under fire. The 110th knew this terrain. Their opponents by late 2022 and into 2023 were learning it the hard way. Russia had concentrated fighting capability, estimates drawn from intercepted communications, and Ukrainian General Staff reporting put multiple battalion tactical groups cycling through the Avdiivka axis, with rotations accelerating as losses mounted. The pressure was sustained and deliberate. Russian command wanted this city. Now here is what most analyses miss about how the brigade actually held. The trench system was not simply a line, it was a depth architecture. Forward observation posts, often just 2 or 3 soldiers in hardened scrapes barely large enough to shelter a team, sat closest to the contact zone, often within direct line of sight of Russian positions. Their job was not to fight, their job was to watch, report, and survive. Behind them, the first belt of fighting trenches connected by communication trenches running perpendicular to the front. Behind that, a second belt. Between the belts, pre-planned artillery target reference points. Specific grid coordinates marked on fire mission plans, each one tied to a section of ground that attackers would have to cross. Further back, tunnel-linked strongpoints. Reinforced positions accessible by underground passage that allowed personnel to move under artillery fire without exposure. The tunnels were not just for protection, they were for tactical repositioning. A section could appear to be destroyed by Russian preparatory fire, then re-emerge at a different point in the line minutes later. What you are looking at, in satellite imagery from Maxar and Planet Labs covering this sector between late 2022 and early 2023, is a defensive layering that resembles, in its logic, the systems used on the Western Front in the First World War. Updated with modern fire control, digital communication, and drone-enabled reconnaissance that the original architects of trench warfare could not have imagined. I spent time working through available geolocated combat footage from this sector, and one detail kept emerging consistently. The kill zones in front of the coke plant's western approaches were not improvised. The Ukrainian positions there had been sited to create interlocking fields of fire, meaning that an attacker moving against one trench section would be exposed to fire from at least 2 other positions simultaneously. Russian vehicles that entered the corridor between the slag heap to the southwest and the plant's outer wall to the north found themselves unable to advance or reverse without remaining in at least one unit's direct engagement zone. Beginning in the late summer and autumn of 2022, Russian forces started a sustained effort to crack this defense. What followed was one of the more methodical attritional campaigns of the entire war. And it is here where the OSINT record becomes genuinely remarkable in its detail. Geolocated footage released across multiple Telegram channels and cross-verified by analysts at groups including Ukrainian Weapons Tracker, Oryx, and the monitoring team at the Institute for the Study of War allows reconstruction of individual assault attempts with a level of precision unusual even in this heavily documented conflict. What the record shows, assault by assault, is a pattern. Russian assault groups, typically a combination of armored vehicles leading infantry, would move from staging areas north and southwest of OP-10 using any available cover and moving along one of the 3 principal vehicle approaches to the plant. Ukrainian observation posts would detect movement, often corroborated by drone reconnaissance from small commercial UAVs modified for military use operating ahead of the contact line. The information would flow back to the fire coordination element, which would pass adjusted target data to artillery units positioned further west. Then came what Ukrainian fire coordinators called the receipt moment, the point at which the approaching column entered pre-registered kill zones, and the artillery missions calculated days or weeks earlier could be executed with minimal adjustment. BM-21 Grad rockets, D-30 howitzers. Later, as Western-supplied systems arrived, 155mm rounds from M777 and Caesar platforms adding precision to the volume. Here is where the FPV contribution becomes critical to understanding the tactical picture, because it is genuinely not well understood outside specialist circles. FPV drone teams from the brigade were not simply using the drones as direct attack weapons, though they certainly did that. They were using them as a channeling mechanism. An FPV drone hovering at several hundred meters over a Russian armored vehicle creates a choice: continue moving and risk a strike, or stop and become a stationary target for artillery. In either case, the vehicle is compromised. The psychological effect of continuous drone presence over an assault formation is degradation of speed and cohesion. Vehicles spread out, infantry dismounts early, commanders lose situational awareness as their attention fractures between the immediate threat overhead and whatever is happening at the contact point ahead. Ukrainian drone operators would use FPV strikes to disable the lead vehicle in a column, often aiming at tracks or running gear rather than attempting full destruction, creating a blockage that turned the following vehicles into cued targets. Satellite imagery from Maxar, captured in the days following several of these engagements and released through open-source research channels, shows the evidence of exactly this tactic. Burned-out vehicles at irregular intervals along the approach lanes, with scorch marks and crater patterns consistent with multiple successive artillery and drone strikes rather than a single engagement. What's most striking about this picture isn't the sophistication of any individual weapon. It's the system integration. Observation, reporting, fire control, drone operations, and artillery all needed to function as a coordinated whole within a time window measured in minutes. The 110th had built, through months of operation in this sector, a fire coordination architecture that was genuinely effective at executing that sequence at tempo. But here is where the obstacle enters the story, because nothing about this defense was frictionless. By mid-autumn 2022, the brigade was facing a problem that threatened to unravel the system it had built: exhaustion. Company-level rotations had been compressed by the operational tempo. Units that should have received rest and reconstitution after 2 to 3 weeks in forward positions were spending 5, 6, 7 weeks without meaningful rotation. Communication trench maintenance was falling behind because the personnel who would normally conduct it were required on observation duty. The fortification belts that formed the structural spine of the defense were solid, but the people occupying them were wearing down. The brigade command's response was not to request additional manpower it didn't have. It was to formalize a rotation schedule built around the minimum survivable unit rather than the optimal one. Squads rather than platoons became the rotation unit for the most exposed forward posts. A squad of 5 soldiers could be rotated into and out of a forward observation position in a single night, using the tunnel systems to move under any Russian surveillance activity. The calculation was brutal but effective. Smaller elements, faster rotation, more total rest for each soldier over a given period, at the cost of thinner presence in any individual position at any given time. The tunnel network made this possible. Forward posts connected to communication trenches connected to the second fighting belt, and from there, underground passages ran back to covered extraction points where vehicles could collect rotating personnel beyond direct observation from Russian lines. The physical infrastructure of the defense was not just about surviving Russian fire. It was about sustaining the human beings inside it long enough to keep fighting. Now we reach the counter-battery dimension, because it is perhaps the least glamorous and most decisive element of the entire defensive picture. Russian artillery supporting the assault operations west of Avdiivka was operating from multiple positions north, east, and south of the contact zone. Counter-battery radar systems operated by Ukrainian forces, including the AN-TPQ-36 and AN-TPQ-37 systems supplied by the United States, and subsequently the more capable counter-battery radars from European partners, were continuously tracking incoming rounds to back-calculate firing positions. The latency between a Russian artillery piece firing and Ukrainian counter-battery fire landing on that position had, by the operational period under analysis, been compressed to between 2 and 4 minutes in favorable conditions. That compression matters enormously. A Russian artillery crew that has fired and cannot relocate within the counter-battery window is at severe risk. The requirement to move frequently degrades rate of fire, interrupts fire missions, and puts pressure on vehicle maintenance as self-propelled systems are constantly on the move. Russian artillery units on the Avdiivka axis showed the signature of this pressure in intercepted communications, references to counter-battery losses, requests for additional ammunition that could not be brought forward quickly enough, and complaints about degraded survey capability that affected firing accuracy. Put yourself in the position of a Russian artillery commander on this axis during the autumn of 2022. You have orders to support assault operations that are, by every measure you can observe, failing. Your forward artillery positions are being engaged within minutes of firing. Your ammunition supply is disrupted. The assault formations you are supposed to be supporting are being stopped by a defensive architecture that your preparatory fires are not degrading fast enough to matter. And the reports coming back from the assault groups describe a defender who seems to reconstitute in positions that should have been empty after your preparatory barrage. What was actually happening was the tunnel effect again. Ukrainian soldiers who had moved through underground passages to escape preparatory bombardment were returning to their fighting positions as the Russian assault groups began to advance. The surface positions showed bomb damage, craters, damaged overhead cover, disturbed earth, consistent with preparation fire having hit them. But the defenders were back because they had never actually left. From a Russian ground perspective, this must have seemed almost hallucinatory. Positions destroyed by bombardment, then occupied again as if the bombardment had never happened. This is where an authorial observation belongs, because it illuminates something about the character of this phase of the war. What we are looking at in the Avdiivka defense is not a story about technological superiority. Ukraine did not have more armor, more aircraft, or more artillery than Russia in this sector. What the 110th demonstrated is that a sufficiently sophisticated defensive architecture, built by soldiers who know their terrain intimately and maintained by a command willing to make operationally difficult decisions about rotation and sustainability, can absorb and defeat a numerically superior attacker indefinitely, provided the physical infrastructure holds and the will to remain does not break. The question that generates the most analytical disagreement about this period is a pointed one. Was Russia's failure on the Avdiivka Western approach a failure of resources or a failure of method? Here's the take that will get pushback from some corners. It was primarily a failure of method, and Russia had the resources to do this differently. The battalion tactical group model, designed for high-tempo offensive operations against a less prepared opponent, was being applied to a set-piece assault against prepared defenses without meaningful adaptation. Russian forces were following recognizable approach routes, the same routes, in some documented cases, multiple times, into kill zones that had been built to stop exactly that type of approach. The assault sequences visible in geolocated footage show armored vehicles leading without adequate infantry screen, moving into ground that had not been meaningfully suppressed beforehand. The failure was doctrinal before it was material. The evidence for this reading comes from the footage itself. Oryx's open-source vehicle loss tracking for the Avdiivka axis, drawing on confirmed photographic evidence, documented dozens of armored vehicle losses in this sector across the period from late 2022 through the spring of 2023. The specific pattern of losses, clustered at the same geographic choke points, in the same approach corridors, often in the same sequence of lead vehicle struck, following vehicles bunching, is not the signature of a force that learned and adapted. It is the signature of a force repeating a failing tactic because it had no immediately available alternative. This is the midpoint of the picture, and it requires a pause to reframe what we are actually watching. Because up to this point, the story has been about Ukrainian success. But the cost of that success is the other half of the ledger, and it cannot be omitted without falsifying the record. The 110th Separate Mechanized Brigade was not an untouched formation conducting clinical fire missions from comfortable positions. It was a unit under continuous pressure, absorbing its own casualties, dealing with its own equipment losses, operating under artillery fire that, even when counter-battery systems degraded Russian accuracy, was never fully suppressed. Soldiers died in those forward observation posts. Communications equipment was destroyed. Trench sections collapsed under direct hits. The casualty figures for the brigade during this period are not publicly confirmed in precise terms. The Ukrainian military's policy on unit-level casualties is understandably restrictive, but the operational tempo and the nature of the fighting make clear that the cost was significant. What do you think? Did the grinding nature of this defense, which preserved the line but at enormous human cost, represent the right strategic choice? Or should Ukraine have sought to trade space for time and reduce those losses? It is a question with no clean answer, and it deserves to stay open. The Western supplied artillery systems that arrived in increasing numbers through late 2022, M777 howitzers, Caesar self-propelled guns, and later the HIMARS multiple rocket launcher systems, changed the counter-battery calculus materially. HIMARS in particular gave Ukrainian fire controllers a precision strike capability they had previously lacked against Russian logistics nodes and ammunition supply points positioned beyond the range of legacy systems. A HIMARS strike on a Russian ammunition storage point 20 kilometers from Avdiivka does not kill the soldiers in the forward trenches immediately, but it degrades the rate of fire those soldiers can sustain over the following days, and on a front where Russian assault operations depended on heavy preparatory fires, that degradation was operationally consequential. One detail that stayed with me in reviewing the timeline of this period is the correlation visible in the OSINT record between HIMARS employment in the wider Donetsk operational area and the rhythm of Russian assault activity on the Avdiivka axis. There are periods, visible in the ISW daily update record and corroborated by Ukrainian General Staff reporting, when Russian assault activity on this front dropped noticeably for several days. These pauses correlate, though causation is difficult to establish with certainty from open-source information alone, with periods when HIMARS strikes in the area had targeted Russian logistics infrastructure. The supply disruption appears in the tactical behavior of Russian units as a temporary reduction in capacity to sustain assault tempo. This is not speculation. U.S. defense officials confirmed in background briefings to journalists during this period that the targeting integration between Ukrainian ground units and HIMARS employment had reached a level of sophistication that allowed reactive strikes against logistics targets within hours of request. The 110th Fire Coordination Element was feeding targeting data not just to organic artillery, but into a wider fire mission queue that included HIMARS-capable systems at the operational level. The brigade was operating as a node in a fire network, not as an isolated tactical unit. By spring 2023, the picture on the Avdiivka axis had developed a particular characteristic that Ukrainian analysts described in internal assessments as exhaustion asymmetry. Russian forces were losing vehicles at a documented rate that exceeded their capacity to regenerate effective combat power in this sector at operational tempo. The assault formations available to Russian commanders on this axis in March and April 2023 were qualitatively degraded relative to those available 6 months earlier. Replacement crews were less experienced. Equipment was older and less well-maintained. Command cohesion at the company and battalion level had been disrupted by officer casualties. Ukrainian forces were also degraded. Both sides in a prolonged attritional engagement suffer attrition, but the defensive architecture of the 110th's position meant that the cost of maintaining the defense was lower than the cost of attacking it, week after week. The asymmetry was structural, not accidental. The intercepted communications record from this period, portions of which were released by Ukrainian intelligence services and authenticated by open-source analysts through acoustic environment matching and radio network identification, is remarkably candid about the frustration at the Russian unit level. Communications between company and battalion commanders on the Avdiivka axis describe confusion about why assault operations are failing, requests for reinforcement and additional equipment that are acknowledged but unmet, and in several cases, direct criticism of the planning assumptions driving the assault orders. There is no ambiguity in this record about the Russian ground truth. The assault was not working. Those conducting it knew it was not working, and the orders continued regardless. Here is where the authorial position on that matters. We should be careful not to read this as evidence of unique Russian dysfunction. Armies in every conflict have continued failing operations under pressure from higher command. What the Avdiivka record shows is the specific cost of that dysfunction when the defender has the intelligence architecture and the fire coordination capability to exploit every attacker mistake fully and immediately. If you follow this war seriously, here is why this episode matters beyond the specific geography. The Avdiivka Coke Plant defense established, in about as clean a form as modern warfare allows, a set of empirical propositions about combined arms defensive operations that NATO planners and military analysts were watching in real time. First, deep trench architecture with tunnel-linked positions defeats preparatory fires more effectively than hardened surface positions. The investment in underground passage construction paid tactical dividends on a daily basis. Second, kill zone preparation. Pre-registered fires, interlocking fields, channeling obstacles, multiplies the effectiveness of available weapons. The 110th was not destroying Russian vehicles because it had more weapons. It was destroying them because it had positioned weapons optimally relative to known approach routes. Third, drone integration at the company level, with FPV operators in direct communication with fire control elements, compresses the sensor-to-shooter timeline in ways that are genuinely consequential. A drone operator who can see a target and speak directly to an artillery fire controller eliminates multiple layers of reporting delay that legacy systems required. Fourth, and perhaps most consequential for NATO doctrine discussions, sustained attritional defense is logistically demanding in ways that differ from the demands of offensive operations. The 110th's ability to maintain this defense over months depended on a steady supply of artillery ammunition, FPV drone components, and communication equipment. Supply chain considerations that might seem administrative in a peacetime context are operationally existential in a prolonged engagement of this type. The tactical lessons of the Avdiivka Western Approach defense were being studied in Warsaw, Tallinn, and Vilnius as they were being made. Baltic and Polish defense planners, operating under the shadow of their own potential confrontation with Russian ground forces, were watching the 110th's methods with an interest that went well beyond academic. Now we arrive at the assessment of cost, which is where honest analysis requires precision rather than advocacy. According to Oryx's open-source confirmed vehicle loss database, Russian forces lost a minimum of several dozen armored vehicles on the Avdiivka axis during the primary period of intensive assault operations in 2022 and 2023. This figure represents only losses confirmed confirmed by photographic or video evidence, the actual total, including vehicles disabled and recovered under fire or destroyed in positions without camera coverage, is certainly higher. The vehicles involved included T-72B3 main battle tanks, BMP-2 and BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles, MTLB armored personnel carriers, and various logistics vehicles. At 2023 replacement costs, a conservative estimate of the material value destroyed in this sector runs into hundreds of millions of dollars. Russian manpower losses, estimated from Ukrainian reporting and cross-referenced against Russian regimental deployment patterns, were proportionally severe, though precise figures remain in the classified domain. Ukrainian losses in this sector were real and significant. Forward observation post personnel were among the highest risk assignments on the entire front. Artillery crew casualties from Russian counter-battery fire accumulated over months. The trench repair and maintenance requirement under continuous shelling meant engineering personnel were regularly exposed to fire. The picture that emerges from available reporting is one of a defending force that held its position but paid a genuine cost for doing so, not a sanitized narrative of easy victory through superior tactics. It is worth noting because it is true and because omitting it would be dishonest. The Avdiivka holding action had a terminus. In February 2024, after months of intensified Russian pressure and following a period in which Ukrainian ammunition supply constraints had materially degraded fire support capability, Ukrainian forces conducted a withdrawal from Avdiivka. The city fell. The slag heaps that had served as natural fortifications for so long became Russian-held ground. But the withdrawal came after Russia had committed to the Avdiivka axis for over a year, sustained losses that degraded multiple assault formations beyond combat effectiveness, and failed to achieve its original objective on its original timeline by an enormous margin. Whether the defense was successful depends entirely on the framework applied. Tactically, the city was eventually lost. Operationally and strategically, the cost imposed on Russian forces during the holding action materially shaped Russian offensive capability across the wider Donetsk front through 2023 and into 2024. Think about what that means in concrete terms. Every battalion tactical group ground down on the Avdiivka Western approach was a formation that could not be simultaneously employed elsewhere. Every ammunition load expended in failed assaults on the Coke Plant approaches was ammunition unavailable for operations on different axes. Every Russian commander who spent months learning the hard lessons of this specific terrain was occupying a command slot that might otherwise have been deployed more effectively. Subscribe to Frontline Truth for weekly OSINT investigations like this one, where we break down the documented record of what is actually happening in this war, rather than what either side's information operations want you to believe. The historical resonances here are not accidental. The combination of industrial terrain, prepared defensive architecture, and attritional grinding that characterize the Avdiivka Coke Plant approaches invites comparison to the battle for Stalingrad's factory district in 1942 and 1943, where Soviet defenders used the broken terrain of industrial facilities to multiply defensive effectiveness in precisely this way. It invites comparison to the fighting around the steelworks of the Ruhr in 1945. And it invites, most uncomfortably for the Russian side, comparison to the industrial siege warfare that characterized exactly the kind of military engagement that the Russian General Staff had repeatedly assured itself would never be necessary in a campaign against Ukraine. Here is the engagement question this raises, and it is genuinely worth thinking about. Similar industrial terrain defense doctrines have been employed in urban industrial contexts going back to the Second World War. Does this mean the Avdiivka defense was simply a rediscovery of existing doctrine? Or does the integration of drone reconnaissance, digital fire control, and precision counter-battery radar represent something genuinely new? Comment below with your read. We go through every response. 3 questions should govern how this battle is remembered in the doctrine literature. First, could Russia have cracked the Avdiivka Western approach defense if it had employed different methods? Almost certainly yes. Mass artillery preparation sufficient to genuinely suppress the tunnel systems, combined with simultaneous pressure from multiple axes to overwhelm the 110th's rotational capacity, would have presented a harder problem. The fact that Russia did not do this reflects either resource limitations, command failure, or both. Understanding which is important for predicting Russian behavior in future set-piece assault operations. Second, how does the Avdiivka template change the calculus for NATO defensive planning in the Baltic region and Poland? The answer, based on the doctrinal literature emerging from defense establishments in those countries since 2023, is substantially. Investments in pre-prepared fighting positions, tunnel and bunker construction, pre-registered fire networks, and organic drone capability at the brigade level have all accelerated in response to exactly the lessons the 110th's defense demonstrated. Third, as Russian forces consolidated control of Avdiivka and moved forward from the plant's industrial core, what came next, and did Russian command absorb the tactical lessons of what it had spent over a year learning at such cost? The answer to that question is still being written on the ground in Donetsk Oblast, where the dynamics of assault and defense that the 110th established continue to shape every engagement. The coke plant still stands. The slag heaps still rise above the steppe. The trenches are still there, though the soldiers who dug them have moved on or are gone. What remains, for anyone willing to look at the satellite imagery and the geolocated footage and the intercepted communications, is a documentary record of how one brigade, in one sector, for one extended period, demonstrated that a prepared defender with integrated fire control and the willingness to absorb cost can reshape the strategic calculus of an entire campaign. That record will be studied. It should be. Frontline truth. Every week, the documented reality of this war.